The chosen one is about to hear a message, one that isn't conveyed through the usual sounds or external voices, but rather in the deepest recesses of their spirit. It's a message that echoes with a weight of divine power, a sound that has reverberated through the heavens louder and more profound than any prayer ever uttered. This sound, however, isn't composed of words or pleas. It's a silence that has accumulated power over time. The silence, once perceived as an absence, has grown to become an unmistakable force, one so profound that it has captured the attention of the divine realm itself. Heaven has been hearing this silence, and it has been louder than any cry for help, any plea for intervention, or any prayer for deliverance. It's the sound of the chosen one's spirit choosing not to ask, but to embody something much more powerful. A silence that demands action. In a world where the common approach to divine connection is to ask, to plead, and to hope for answers, the chosen one has taken an entirely different path. Instead of filling the air with requests and demands, they chose to weaponize their silence, while others may have been caught in the cycle of asking for help, for guidance, or for intervention. The chosen one understood something that others didn't. They recognized the untapped potential in silence. They knew that silence, when held strategically, wasn't a sign of weakness, but a force that carried divine weight. This silence was not empty. It was filled with intention. It was filled with power, and most importantly, it was filled with the kind of encoded message that could not be ignored by the heavens. In a world of noise, they chose to remain silent, not as a defeat, but as an act of spiritual warfare. They were creating divine conditions that would eventually make it impossible for God's silence to continue. This wasn't just any silence. It was a silence that served as a foundation, a strategic move in a spiritual battle that others could not even comprehend. While others sought louder prayers and more vocal cries for help, the chosen one understood that their silence was an act of encoding a way to communicate with the divine in a language that went beyond words. Every moment of restraint, every tear held back, every word unsaid, was part of a larger plan, a plan that would eventually lead to an explosive breakthrough. The silence wasn't just a void. It was the key to unlocking a divine response that could not be ignored. In a world that values noise and expression, the chosen one found power in stillness and silence. This silence wasn't passive, it was active. It wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who understood that in the absence of words, something greater was being encoded. The divine conditions that the chosen one created through their silence were no accident. They were the result of a deep, intentional act of spiritual encoding, one that would eventually collapse the restraint systems in heaven. Heaven operates on protocols, on systems and rules that govern divine intervention. For months, even years, these systems had been telling the chosen one, not yet urging them to wait, urging them to remain in silence. But what the chosen one did not realize was that every moment of silence was not just passive endurance. It was a force, a message being encoded in a frequency that heaven could not filter out. Heaven's systems were built to resist certain kinds of pleas, certain kinds of prayers, and certain kinds of cries for help. But the silence of the chosen one was different. It wasn't a cry for help. It was an invitation for heaven to break its own protocols. It was a divine strategy that broke through the very system that had kept heaven's intervention at bay for so long. The chosen one's decision to remain silent rather than allowing their pain to manifest in words or screams was not just an act of restraint. It was a deliberate, powerful choice that carried deep spiritual significance. Every moment, they chose to stay quiet. When every part of them longed to cry out, was not a sign of weakness or defeat. but a calculated strategy. In those moments of silence, they were encoding something far beyond the physical realm, turning their suffering into spiritual ammunition. Pain, when compressed and held in the spirit, becomes a potent force, one that holds the power to shift the very fabric of reality. The silence of the chosen one wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was a direct communication with the divine, an encrypted message that resonated with heaven in a frequency beyond human comprehension. In a world where noise and expression are often seen as the only means to make a change, the chosen one understood that silence could be more powerful than any shout. The act of staying silent in the face of adversity was a form of encoding that transcended the visible realm. It was as if each unspoken word, each tear held back, and each prayer not voiced was a line of divine code being written in the spirit. This wasn't passive suffering. This was active spiritual warfare. They weren't simply enduring, they were strategically placing each moment of restraint into a divine encryption system, a system that heaven would eventually be forced to acknowledge. The silence, though seemingly empty, was a vehicle for divine power. The breakthrough wasn't about completing an impossible task. It was about creating the conditions in which divine silence became impossible. The chosen one had unknowingly become the architect of a divine breakthrough by learning the language of silence. What makes silence so powerful in the divine context? It's not merely the absence of sound, but the quality of that silence. Every moment, the chosen one chose silence over the noise of the world. They were aligning themselves with the divine silence protocol, a spiritual law that governs how heaven responds to earth. This protocol, though invisible to most, governs when and how divine intervention occurs. Heaven has systems, structures, and protocols that determine when God can act and when he must remain silent. These systems were put in place to maintain divine order and timing, ensuring that the celestial realm operates in harmony with the will of God. But the chosen one's silence broke through these established barriers. By remaining silent, they unknowingly created a divine breach, a disruption in the very system that controlled when heaven could intervene. Each act of silence by the chosen one was like a key being turned in the lock of divine restraint. Heaven, with all its protocols and systems, was built to remain passive until certain conditions were met. Prayers had to be loud enough, desperate enough, or fervent enough to break through the silence. But the chosen one, in their wisdom, discovered that there was another way to trigger heaven's response. They understood that silence could carry more weight than words. Silence, when held with intention and understanding, could bypass heaven's protocols and create a direct line to divine action. It wasn't about the loudness of the cry. It was about the depth of the restraint. In their silence, they triggered a system failure in heaven's protocols, an overload that no longer allowed the restraint to hold. The silence of the chosen one became a divine signal so powerful that it couldn't be ignored. But what exactly did the chosen one achieve in their silence? Heaven operates under strict protocols, systems designed to maintain order and precision. These systems are governed by spiritual laws, one of which is divine restraint, God's ability to withhold intervention until certain conditions are met. For months, maybe even years, the chosen one's silence went unnoticed, at least by the world around them. But in the unseen realm, their silence was speaking volumes. Every moment, they chose restraint over release. They were transmitting an encoded message, a signal so pure and intense that it began to affect the very foundations of heaven's protocols. It was as if heaven had a filter, one designed to hold back certain prayers, certain pleas, and certain actions until they reached a particular level of urgency or volume. But the chosen one had found a way to bypass that filter entirely. In their silence, they had unknowingly activated a chain reaction, a cosmic event that couldn't be stopped. The very systems that had once restrained heaven's intervention were now being dismantled, one act of silence at a time. Each choice to remain silent when they could have spoken, each decision to withhold their pain when they could have screamed, added another layer of intensity to their divine encryption. Heaven was receiving this message even if it couldn't yet respond. And in that moment, when the encryption was complete, heaven had no choice but to respond. The silence once held for so long became too strong for heaven's systems to ignore. It wasn't about the chosen one's suffering. It was about the power they had unknowingly harnessed through their silence. This divine response wasn't just a simple acknowledgement of a prayer or plea. It was a chain reaction, one that shook the very foundations of heaven's restraint system. The silence, when used strategically, created a breach that couldn't be undone. It was as though the chosen one had found the master key, the one thing that could unlock heaven's doors and trigger divine intervention on their behalf. What had been impossible, breaking through heaven's protocols and creating the conditions for divine action, had now become inevitable. The chosen one's silence had done what no amount of vocal prayers could do. They had created a spiritual environment where heaven's intervention was no longer optional. It was mandatory. Heaven's restraint, once a protective measure, was now rendered obsolete in the face of the chosen one's strategic silence. The divine response, once delayed, was now coming at full force, unstoppable and undeniable. In this moment, the chosen one's silence became the key that unlocked the door to divine action. What had once seemed like a passive act holding back words, emotions, and pain was actually the most powerful spiritual weapon in their arsenal. Heaven had heard the signal loud and clear, and now it was time for divine intervention. The breakthrough wasn't about performing or striving harder. It was about creating the conditions for heaven's response to become inevitable. The silence, once a weapon of restraint, had now become a weapon of divine activation. The chosen one had unknowingly mastered the art of spiritual warfare, using silence as their greatest weapon. And now, with the systems in heaven activated, the divine response was set in motion. The word finally spoken by God was not just a simple expression. It was a divine declaration that marked a turning point, an end to the frustration that had been building for what seemed like an eternity. This was not God's exclamation of triumph over the chosen one's efforts, but rather the moment when heaven's restraint systems, long in place, could no longer hold back the response that had been waiting to come. The silent efforts of the chosen one, though unnoticed by many, had reached a tipping point. A point where divine intervention became not a matter of choice but of necessity. The restraint that had held heaven in a waiting pattern for so long was now being shattered, and the time for action had arrived. This wasn't about the chosen one merely praying for help or asking for intervention. It was about them creating the conditions through their silent obedience that made divine action inevitable. The breakthrough that followed was not an accident nor a delayed reaction. It was the direct result of the chosen one's intentionality in encoding their silence. Every moment spent in restraint, every tear held back, every word unspoken, was part of a spiritual encoding process that resonated so deeply with heaven's systems that it triggered a mandatory response. The divine protocols that had once restrained God's intervention could no longer ignore the frequency of silence that the chosen one had sent. What had once seemed like passive endurance now revealed its true power, the ability to bypass all human understanding and trigger a divine breakthrough on a cosmic scale. The silence was no longer just a sign of waiting. It was the key to unlocking heaven's response. God's finally wasn't a reaction to the chosen one's desperation. It was a statement that heaven had heard and was now compelled to act. To understand the full weight of this moment, we need to recognize that heaven operates under systems and protocols that are carefully designed to maintain divine order and timing. These systems are not arbitrary. They are divine laws that ensure everything aligns with God's perfect plan. For months, maybe even years, the Chosen One had unknowingly been in the process of breaking through these protocols. The systems in heaven had been holding back, waiting for the right moment, the right conditions. But those conditions had been met through the Chosen One's silent actions. While others may have been vocal in their pleas, asking for breakthroughs and demanding answers, the Chosen One did something far more profound. They didn't just ask, they encoded their prayers, their pain, and their silence in such a way that heaven's systems had no choice but to respond. The finally was the moment when heaven's protocols could no longer restrain the response that had been triggered by the Chosen One's actions. It wasn't a matter of God deciding when to move, it was a divine obligation that was now set in motion. This breakthrough, this divine intervention was not optional for heaven. Once the Chosen One had completed the encoding process, heaven was compelled to respond. It wasn't just about divine timing anymore. It was about a cosmic law being fulfilled. The divine silence that had been held by heaven was no longer sustainable. The restraint that had been maintained was broken because the Chosen One had created the necessary conditions for heaven to move. The silence had reached a point where it had become too potent for heaven to ignore. It had become a signal, a frequency that could no longer be filtered out by divine protocols. What had once been an unspoken law, the idea that God must remain silent until certain conditions were met, had been shattered. The Chosen One had unknowingly found the code that made God's silence impossible, and in doing so, they activated a divine response that was now mandatory. This moment of divine breakthrough wasn't simply a victory for the Chosen One, it was a victory for divine order itself. The breakthrough was a direct result of the conditions the Chosen One had created through their silence. It was a breakthrough in the spiritual realm that could not be undone. Every moment of silence, every act of restraint, every choice to endure without vocalizing their pain, had been part of a larger plan that now unfolded before them. What seemed like a long period of waiting, a time of unanswered prayers, had actually been a process of building divine pressure, of encoding a message that heaven could no longer resist. The moment God said finally was the moment when everything aligned perfectly, when the conditions for divine intervention were met, and when heaven could no longer withhold its response. It was a powerful reminder that silence, when used strategically, is a force that can break through even the most rigid divine systems. The beauty of this breakthrough lies in the fact that it was not earned by the Chosen One through traditional means of striving or effort. It wasn't about praying harder, fasting longer, or performing better. It was about creating a spiritual environment where silence became the most powerful form of communication. This is what made the breakthrough so profound. The Chosen One didn't just endure, they encoded. They weren't just waiting for heaven to move. They were laying the foundation for heaven to act. The silence that had once felt like a burden now became the key that unlocked the doors of divine intervention. The finally wasn't just about the end of divine restraint. It was the beginning of something much greater. It was the moment when heaven's silence broke and divine action was set into motion. The Chosen One had unknowingly completed the task that had been impossible for so many others. They had created the conditions for divine response. In this divine moment, the Chosen One's silence became the catalyst for heaven's action. Every act of restraint, every moment of quiet endurance had been building toward this moment of divine breakthrough. What was once seen as passive waiting was now revealed to be a strategic weapon, one that had triggered a divine response that was unstoppable. The finally was the declaration of a victory that had been written in the spiritual realm long before it manifested on earth. Heaven could no longer stay silent because the conditions for divine intervention had been met. The Chosen One's silence had become a force so powerful that it brought heaven's restraint to its breaking point, unleashing a wave of divine action that could not be delayed or denied. The breakthrough wasn't just a personal victory, it was a cosmic event, one that had been encoded in silence, waiting for the right moment to unfold. And that moment, marked by God's finally, had arrived. In the grand scheme of spiritual warfare, the Chosen One unknowingly mastered something far more powerful than mere silence. They had, without conscious effort, tapped into 7 distinct types of silence, each acting as a unique encryption protocol that called upon divine response. Each of these silences, though seemingly simple or even passive in nature, held within them the keys to unlocking heaven's intervention, bypassing divine restraint systems that had kept heaven's response at bay for so long. What the Chosen One didn't realize was that their every moment of quietness was in fact a form of communication, a transmission of divine energy that resonated with a frequency heaven could no longer ignore. These 7 types of silence became the strategic moves in a game that was far beyond the comprehension of most. They were not just enduring their trials, they were encoding their breakthroughs one silent moment at a time. The first type of silence the Chosen One unknowingly employed was prophetic silence. This is the silence that occurs when the spirit knows something before the mind can fully comprehend it. And yet, instead of speaking, the Chosen One holds back, allowing the divine timing to unfold. Prophetic silence is a quiet awareness, a deep knowing that resonates in the spirit even when circumstances do not yet align with that inner truth. The Chosen One may have found themselves awake in the stillness of the night, sensing a shift yet remaining silent, when every part of them wanted to cry out in prayer. They chose to wait, to let the moment build within them, without rushing to announce or claim it. This silence encoded the precise timing needed for heaven's intervention. It wasn't about speaking the words too early, but about waiting for the divine signal. In this prophetic silence, the Chosen One set into motion the conditions that would trigger the right moment for action, knowing that sometimes the most powerful prayer is the one left unspoken. The silence creating space for the divine timing to complete its course. The second type of silence the Chosen One unknowingly wielded was warfare silence. This is the silence chosen in the heat of spiritual battle, when the enemy's attacks seem relentless, and every instinct urges a counterattack. But instead of reacting, instead of defending themselves, or striking back, the Chosen One chose silence. In these moments, when the enemy's words or actions were designed to provoke a reaction, the Chosen One remained still, their silence becoming a shield that disarmed the forces of darkness. Every attack was met not with an outburst or an argument, but with an unspoken resolve. In this warfare silence, the Chosen One didn't need to defend themselves. They understood that heaven doesn't respond to their defense, it responds to their restraint. This silence was an active act of resistance, a strategy that left the enemy with no foothold, no way to provoke or break the Chosen One's spirit. It was through this silence that divine authority began to take hold, turning every moment of restraint into spiritual power. The silence didn't mean the Chosen One was passive. It meant they were standing firm, letting heaven do the fighting. The third type of silence was worship silence, a powerful form of silence that transcends traditional expressions of worship. In moments when the atmosphere around the chosen one was filled with praise, when voices were lifted in song and hands were raised in devotion, the chosen one stood still, their mouth closed, their heart opened. This wasn't a rebellion against worship, nor was it a sign of disconnectedness. It was a deeper kind of worship, one that went beyond outward expression. In these moments, the chosen one understood that true intimacy with the divine wasn't always displayed in public praise. It was felt in the quietest of moments, when the heart was fully engaged in silent adoration. The chosen one's worship was too deep for words, too profound for outward display. While others performed, they communed. This silence was an encoding of intimacy, a sacred transmission between their soul and heaven, a frequency of connection that couldn't be seen, but could only be felt. Through this worship silence, the chosen one connected with the divine in a way that bypassed earthly expectations, encoding a spiritual signal so powerful that it invited heaven's response. Then came lament silence, the fourth type of silence, which was perhaps the most profound. This was the silence born out of deep grief, when words felt too empty to express the weight of pain and sorrow. In these moments, the chosen one would cry, but the tears fell in silence. The ache in their chest was too much to bear, but even in the deepest sorrow, they chose silence. There was no plea, no outburst, just a deep internal lament that couldn't be put into words. This wasn't a silence of defeat. It was a silence that carried the weight of the world. In their grief, the chosen one unknowingly encoded their pain, turning their suffering into spiritual power. Each tear that fell without sound, each sob that went unheard, was a line of divine code. Heaven didn't just see the chosen one's pain. They saw the encryption being created in the silence of their suffering. This lament silence, though unnoticed by the world, was a powerful signal to the divine realm, one that carried the potential for transformation and breakthrough. It was in this silence that heaven's heart responded to the chosen one's deepest pain. The fifth type of silence was submission silence. This is the silence the chosen one chose when their will was clear, when they knew what they wanted, but they chose not to demand it. Instead of pushing for their desires, they surrendered them to God, trusting that His will would be done. In moments when the path seemed clear and the decision felt certain, the chosen one refrained from forcing their way forward. They chose to remain silent, laying down their own desires, and instead, they placed their trust fully in God's timing. This silence wasn't passive. It was active trust, a submission of the will that encoded a deep surrender into heaven's system. By choosing silence in the face of decision, the chosen one was encoding faith. Every moment they chose to surrender instead of demanding was a transmission of divine trust, an act that allowed heaven to step in and orchestrate the perfect outcome. It was a submission silence that activated divine intervention by releasing control and aligning with God's perfect plan. The sixth type of silence was protective silence, a silence that guarded the sacred. This silence was chosen when others asked about the chosen one's journey, about their process, about their struggles, and they knew that these details were too sacred to share with just anyone. In these moments, the chosen one would smile and say, "I'm fine," even when they were breaking inside. But this silence wasn't a lie. It was protection. It was the act of guarding the sacred spaces of the Spirit, keeping them safe from the unqualified hands of those who could not understand. This silence encoded a protective barrier around the chosen one's heart, keeping their deepest struggles and triumphs within the divine realm. Heaven saw the protection, recognizing that the chosen one was preserving what was sacred and needed to be kept hidden. In this protective silence, the chosen one sent a message to heaven that they were trusting God to handle the situation, keeping it out of the hands of others who weren't meant to intervene. Finally, there was commissioning silence, the silence chosen when the chosen one felt the call, but refused to announce it prematurely. In these moments, the chosen one knew their divine assignment, but kept it to themselves, waiting for heaven's timing to make the public declaration. The silence wasn't out of fear, it was out of trust. The chosen one knew that when the time was right, God would reveal the calling to others. This silence wasn't about hiding, it was about preparing. By remaining silent, the chosen one encoded a deep spiritual readiness, signaling to heaven that they were willing to move in divine timing, not according to their own schedule. In this silence, the chosen one was not passive. They were actively preparing, allowing God to direct the unfolding of their divine purpose. Together. These 7 types of silence created a powerful encryption system, one that bypassed heaven's protocols and forced divine action. The chosen one unknowingly had unlocked the secret of silence and used it to trigger a response from heaven that could not be ignored. These silences were not mere passive moments of endurance. They were powerful transmissions encoded with divine intent and destined to bring about the breakthrough that was so desperately needed. Through their silence, the chosen one had become a master of divine encryption, sending messages to heaven that could no longer be filtered out. Heaven responded because the silence had reached a point where it could not be ignored. The divine response was mandatory, not optional, because the chosen one had created the perfect conditions for heaven's intervention. The chosen one's silence was not merely the absence of sound. It was a profound act of encoding a spiritual encryption that held immense power. Every moment of restraint, every tear unshed, every word unspoken was a deliberate transmission, a signal to the divine realm that carried more weight than any spoken prayer ever could. Silence, when held with purpose, becomes far more than a passive state. It becomes an active, potent force capable of breaking through spiritual barriers and creating a direct link to heaven. In these moments of silence, the chosen one wasn't simply withholding their words. They were encoding them, turning every unexpressed emotion, every unsaid prayer, and every unspoken thought into a spiritual message that heaven could not ignore. What seemed like passive endurance was actually a highly strategic act, a deliberate decision to send out a frequency so powerful that it reached beyond the veil of heaven's restraint systems. This encoding process, though unseen, was far from inconsequential. Each moment of silence was a building block in the divine transmission system, each unspoken thought acting as a data point in a larger message that heaven was receiving. When the chosen one chose to remain silent, instead of expressing their pain, frustration, or confusion, they weren't just suffering in quiet. They were compressing their emotions, channeling them into a form that could not be filtered out. Each silent prayer, each moment of holding back a scream, was a powerful signal encoded with spiritual intent. These moments of restraint became the code that activated divine systems, opening a channel of communication between heaven and earth that could not be ignored. The silence, though seemingly empty, was laden with spiritual significance. It wasn't about avoiding expression. It was about transforming that expression into a higher form of communication, one that resonated with the divine frequency. Heaven, attuned to these transmissions, could no longer turn a blind eye. The silence became a message, a call for action, and it triggered the divine response that had been waiting to be activated. The silence was not just about avoiding noise. It was about creating space for heaven to move in a way that was not constrained by earthly limits. In this silence, the chosen one was encoding spiritual data at a level that others could not fathom. They weren't just enduring. They were crafting a divine message that would eventually break through the limitations of time and space. Every moment of silence added to the encryption, strengthening the signal that was being sent. Heaven wasn't ignoring the chosen one's silence, it was listening intently. The power of silence lies in its ability to communicate in ways that words often cannot. While others might have prayed louder, fought harder, or demanded more, the chosen one understood that silence, when used strategically, was a much more potent form of spiritual warfare. It wasn't about the volume of their requests. It was about the depth of their restraint, the intention behind their silence. They had found a way to communicate with heaven that bypassed the usual filters, triggering a divine response that was not only heard, but acted upon. The chosen one didn't consciously know they were encoding, but through each day of silent resilience, they were activating a divine response system that many others could not. Most people in their spiritual journeys are conditioned to think that they must perform to be heard by heaven, that louder prayers, more fervent cries, or more passionate acts of faith are the key to unlocking divine intervention. But the chosen one stumbled upon something entirely different. They discovered that the true key to divine response was not found in performing for heaven, it was found in creating the conditions that made divine action inevitable. Their silent endurance, their ability to hold their emotions and desires within, became the very trigger that activated heaven's intervention. The chosen one didn't need to scream for attention. They had already created the environment where heaven had no choice but to respond. The silence that others might have viewed as weakness or defeat was in reality the most powerful act of spiritual engagement they could have undertaken. Through their silent resilience, the chosen one unknowingly activated a divine system that others failed to tap into. While many would have thought that their silence was a sign of inaction or passivity, it was in fact the opposite. Their silence was an act of spiritual power, an act that sent out a frequency so strong that it disrupted the divine restraint systems in heaven. Heaven could no longer remain passive because the chosen one had unknowingly created the perfect conditions for divine action. This wasn't a matter of earning God's attention through louder prayers or more fervent requests. It was about creating a spiritual environment where heaven had no choice but to move. The chosen one's silence had accomplished what words could never do. It had breached the systems in heaven, triggering a response that was now mandatory. What is truly remarkable about this process is that the chosen one didn't consciously set out to break these barriers. They weren't trying to encode a message, they were simply surviving, moving through each day with silent strength. And yet in doing so, they had activated a response system that others were unknowingly unable to access. They weren't performing spiritual rituals or acting according to a prescribed formula. They were simply choosing silence when others would have spoken, choosing restraint when others would have fought back. In their silent endurance, they had unknowingly stumbled upon the secret that many spiritual warriors miss the power of silence as a strategic act of spiritual encoding. This divine breakthrough wasn't about doing something impossible. It was about creating the conditions in which heaven's response could no longer be avoided. The silence, which might have seemed like nothing to the human eye, was the key to unlocking heaven's intervention. Every act of restraint, every moment of silent endurance was a building block in the divine encryption system. Heaven's response was not something that could be earned or forced. It was activated by the chosen one's ability to hold their silence in such a way that it became impossible for heaven to remain quiet. This breakthrough was the result of spiritual encoding that bypassed the limitations of the physical world, tapping into a frequency that only heaven could respond to. In this silence, the Chosen One unknowingly created the environment where heaven's intervention became not just possible, but inevitable. Through their silent prayers, their unspoken tears, and their quiet strength, they had encoded a message so powerful that it could not be ignored. Heaven had no choice but to respond, because the silence had reached a point where it was impossible to maintain divine restraint any longer. The silence wasn't just a form of endurance. It was a spiritual tool that had been wielded with greater effectiveness than any spoken word. And in that moment, when heaven's restraint systems collapsed, the divine response was unleashed in a way that could not be stopped. The silence had done its work, and the breakthrough had arrived. Divine timing is the invisible thread that weaves together the fabric of all creation, a mechanism so precise that even the Almighty operates within its bounds. God in His wisdom follows a divine rhythm, a cadence that cannot be rushed or forced. Everything in the heavenly realm moves according to this perfect timing. Heaven's silence, then, is not an absence, but a waiting period, an awaiting of the exact moment when the conditions align perfectly for divine intervention. God, in His boundless power, does not act arbitrarily. His movements are not subject to human impatience or desperation. The task that the Chosen One faced was not impossible because it was too difficult or beyond their abilities. It was impossible because it required a precise set of spiritual conditions, conditions that until now had not been met. It wasn't the challenge of the task that stood in the way, but the divine protocols in heaven that had to be broken. The divine protocols that govern heaven's silence are based on the laws of spiritual alignment, divine order, and sacred timing. These protocols ensure that everything unfolds according to God's perfect plan, with each action following the divine order. God cannot intervene until the right frequency is reached, until the conditions are aligned in such a way that His intervention does not violate the laws of spiritual precision. The silence of heaven, then, is not a punishment or a sign of disinterest. It is part of a greater divine system, one that ensures everything operates in harmony with God's will. But the Chosen One, in their silence, unknowingly broke through these barriers. They created a frequency so pure, so strong, that heaven's protocols could no longer filter it out. The silence was not just an absence of sound. It was a spiritual force, an encoded message sent directly to heaven that could no longer be ignored. It wasn't just faith or good deeds that triggered heaven's response. It was the right spiritual encoding. The perfect conditions for divine action to unfold. Heaven had been waiting for this moment, waiting for the Chosen One to create the spiritual frequency that would break through the divine restraint. It wasn't about trying harder, praying louder, or believing stronger. The task was never about earning God's attention. It was about aligning with divine timing in such a way that heaven could no longer remain silent. The Chosen One's silence created a space in the spiritual realm that heaven could no longer ignore. Every moment of restraint, every word left unsaid, every tear held back, was part of the divine encoding process that would unlock heaven's response. Heaven's silence was no longer sustainable because the Chosen One had done the work to align with the divine rhythm, creating a divine resonance that could no longer be contained. This breakthrough was the result of a perfect spiritual alignment. It was as if the Chosen One had unknowingly entered into a spiritual agreement with God, a divine synchrony that was perfectly timed. The silence, once perceived as a weakness or a passive act of endurance, was now revealed as the catalyst for divine timing to unfold. The Chosen One's ability to hold their silence created the right spiritual conditions. And with those conditions in place, heaven's response became mandatory. The silence wasn't an absence. It was the precursor to a divine action that could no longer be delayed or ignored. God's timing had always been at work in the background, but the chosen one's silence had accelerated the process, causing heaven to act when the time was right. It wasn't that God was waiting for the chosen one to do something. It was that heaven had been waiting for the right frequency to align. And when it did, the divine response was unleashed. The divine protocols in heaven are not arbitrary. They are rooted in the laws of divine order. God in His wisdom cannot intervene unless the conditions are met in a precise way. The chosen one in their silence had unknowingly met those conditions, breaking through the barriers that had kept heaven's response at bay. This wasn't about being good enough or faithful enough. It was about aligning with the divine system, creating a frequency that heaven could not deny. The chosen one's silence was the key that unlocked heaven's intervention. And once that frequency was set in motion, the divine response was inevitable. It wasn't just a matter of divine timing, it was about divine law. Heaven operates under spiritual laws, and one of those laws is that God cannot act unless the right conditions are met. But when the chosen one created the right spiritual conditions, heaven had no choice but to respond. The silence that had once felt like waiting frustration or abandonment had in reality been the most powerful tool of all. It had been the secret weapon that unlocked the divine timing setting in motion, a response that was unstoppable. Divine timing is not a linear process. It is a cosmic rhythm, a pulse that flows through all creation. And in this moment, the chosen one had unknowingly attuned themselves to that rhythm. They had created the conditions in the spiritual realm that allowed heaven to move without hesitation. The silence was not just a pause, it was a deliberate act of creation, a spiritual act that brought heaven into alignment with the chosen one's journey. The breakthrough that followed was not an isolated event. It was the result of divine timing meeting the perfect spiritual conditions created by the chosen one's silence. The silence wasn't about avoiding action. It was about creating space for heaven to act. By holding their silence, the chosen one created the perfect moment for divine intervention, allowing heaven's response to unfold in its perfect timing. It wasn't a coincidence or an accident. It was the result of aligning with the divine frequency, setting the stage for heaven's intervention to happen with perfect precision. The divine silence that had once seemed like a period of waiting was now revealed to be the most important part of the process. The chosen one had unknowingly created the environment for divine action by choosing silence when it seemed like the most difficult thing to do. They had aligned with the divine rhythm in such a way that heaven could no longer remain passive. The divine timing, once held in check by spiritual protocols, was now set into motion because the chosen one had created the perfect conditions for it. This was the true power of divine timing. It wasn't about waiting for heaven to act on human terms, but about aligning with heaven's perfect order so that the response could come at the right time. The chosen one's silence had in essence acted as a catalyst, speeding up the process and triggering heaven's response at the precise moment it was needed. This wasn't just about breaking through a moment of divine silence. It was about understanding that silence is a part of the divine timing process. The silence was not an obstacle to overcome. It was an essential part of the divine blueprint. The chosen one had been aligned with that blueprint all along, and their silence had created the conditions for heaven's intervention to unfold at the right time. In that moment, when heaven's silence broke, the chosen one realized that they had been a part of something far greater than themselves. They had unknowingly participated in the divine orchestration of events, creating the perfect alignment for heaven to respond. And now, with heaven's response coming into action, The chosen one would step into a new phase of divine purpose, knowing that their silence had set everything in motion. The 7 types of silence, though seemingly simple, carry within them profound spiritual power. Each one holds the potential to unlock divine response in a way that words and actions alone could never achieve. These silences are not merely moments of quiet or restraint. They are acts of strategic spiritual warfare, powerful transmissions to heaven, each designed to communicate a deep encoded message that triggers a divine response. The chosen one unknowingly navigated through each of these types of silence, each one playing a unique role in the unfolding of their spiritual journey and ultimately triggering the breakthrough that heaven had been waiting for. The first type of silence the chosen one mastered was prophetic silence, a silence that is held in anticipation, a silence that speaks louder than any words could. This type of silence is deeply rooted in divine timing, knowing when to speak and when to wait. The chosen one at various points in their journey may have felt the stirring of the Spirit, the deep knowing that something was about to happen, but rather than jumping ahead with words or actions, they chose to wait. They felt a divine urge to move, yet something within them whispered, "Not yet." In these moments, the chosen one's obedience to timing was the key to unlocking divine intervention. Prophetic silence is not just about holding back words. It's about aligning with the divine flow, understanding that the right moment for action will come in God's perfect timing. The chosen one's restraint in these moments created a space for heaven's perfect plan to unfold, setting the stage for divine action to take place at precisely the right time. The silence was not a sign of hesitation, but a deep spiritual awareness that the time for speaking or acting had not yet arrived. In waiting, the chosen one unknowingly encoded the right frequency that would, when the time was right, trigger a response from heaven that was both timely and necessary. The second type of silence the chosen one embodied was warfare silence, a silence chosen in the midst of spiritual battle. This is the silence that is chosen when the enemy is attacking, when accusations are flying, when mocking and criticism come from every side. In these moments, the chosen one could have defended themselves, could have fought back with words, but instead they chose silence. The warfare silence is an act of faith and trust in divine authority, a refusal to engage in the enemy's tactics, knowing that God would fight on their behalf. This silence is a weapon. It's not passive resignation, but a deliberate choice to trust in God's power and sovereignty. In warfare silence, the chosen one withholds their own defense, recognizing that heaven's response will be far more powerful than anything they could do on their own. Every moment spent in silence during attack was a victory in spiritual warfare. It was a direct challenge to the enemy's power, a refusal to engage in the battle on earthly terms. Instead, the chosen one chose to let divine authority take control, knowing that heaven would rise to their defense. This silence wasn't weakness. It was strength rooted in trust and spiritual understanding. And it activated a divine response that was unstoppable. The third type of silence was worship silence, a silence that occurs during worship when the chosen one's heart is in deep communion with God, but their outward expression is still. In moments of worship, when the atmosphere is filled with music and praise, the chosen one may have stood in stillness, hands at their sides, mouth closed, yet fully engaged in the deepest form of worship. This is not a silence of rebellion or disconnection. It is a silence of intimacy. Worship silence is a deeper connection with God, one that transcends external expressions. While others may have been shouting praises or singing songs, the chosen one's worship was being encoded in a frequency beyond words. In their silence, they were communicating with God in a way that couldn't be seen, but could be felt, a deep, unspoken communion that bypassed earthly limitations. The silence, though outwardly still, was filled with spiritual significance. It was in these moments that the chosen one's worship transcended the physical realm and connected deeply with the divine. Their silence was a form of spiritual encoding, a transmission of love, reverence, and devotion that heaven could receive without the need for any outward display. In worship silence, the chosen one found an intimacy with God that words could not fully express, and it was in this silence that heaven's response was encoded, ready to unfold in divine timing. The fourth type of silence the chosen one carried was lament silence, a silence born out of grief when words felt inadequate to express the depth of pain. This type of silence is often born from moments of profound sorrow when the chosen one's heart is breaking, but they can find no words to speak. In these moments of grief, the chosen one may have cried silently, their sobs muffled by the weight of their pain. They carried their suffering in silence, unable to express the depth of their sorrow to anyone else. But in this lament silence, something incredibly powerful was taking place. The chosen one wasn't simply bottling up their emotions. They were encoding their pain in a way that made it powerful. Every tear that fell without sound was a line of divine code. Every moment of grief that went unspoken was a transmission to heaven, a spiritual encryption that carried their suffering to the divine realm. Lament silence is a transformative act of spiritual endurance. It is the moment when pain becomes power. The chosen one's grief, though silent, became a tool that heaven could use to create divine breakthrough. The silence wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a form of spiritual resilience, a powerful encoding of suffering that would eventually bring about transformation and divine intervention. In their silence, the chosen one's pain became the raw material for divine power, and heaven was poised to respond. The fifth type of silence was submission silence, a silence that occurs when the chosen one, knowing exactly what they want, chooses to remain silent and trust God's plan. In moments when the path seemed clear, when the desire for a specific outcome burned deeply within them, the chosen one could have pushed for it, could have prayed aggressively, or demanded God's intervention. But instead, they chose to remain silent, surrendering their own will and desires to God. Submission silence is a deeply spiritual act of trust, a refusal to force God's hand, but a willingness to wait for His timing. This silence encoded deep spiritual submission, a message to heaven that the chosen one was willing to let go of their own agenda and trust in God's perfect plan. In submission silence, the chosen one demonstrated an unwavering belief that God's will would prevail, and they were willing to remain silent even when the urge to push or demand was strong. This type of silence activated divine intervention because in choosing to submit, the chosen one aligned themselves fully with heaven's will. It wasn't a silence of defeat. It was a silence of total trust and surrender, a silence that set in motion the perfect unfolding of divine purpose. The sixth type of silence was protective silence, a silence that is used to guard the sacred. This silence is chosen when the chosen one knows that there are aspects of their journey that are too sacred to share with others, when they recognize that certain things must be kept between them and God. In these moments, the chosen one may have been asked about their struggles, their pain, or their plans, but they chose to keep those things to themselves, protecting them from the prying eyes and judgment of others. Protective silence is an act of spiritual discernment. It is the ability to recognize when something is too sacred to expose to the world. The chosen one's silence in these moments encoded a deep spiritual protection. It was a refusal to allow anything or anyone to contaminate or interfere with what God was doing in their life. Heaven saw this silence as an act of trust, an act of protection that created space for divine work to unfold in secret. This protective silence became a shield that kept the chosen one's heart and purpose safe. and it set the conditions for divine intervention to work undisturbed by external distractions. The seventh and final type of silence was commissioning silence, the silence that the chosen one chose when they felt a divine calling but waited for heaven's permission to move. In moments when the chosen one knew they had received a calling, a divine assignment, they could have rushed to announce it, to share it with the world, to take action and start building. But instead, they chose to wait in silence, trusting that God would reveal the timing when it was right to act. Commissioning silence is a powerful act of spiritual obedience. It is the refusal to move ahead of God's timing, the decision to wait until heaven's direction is clear. In this silence, the chosen one encoded obedience, trust, and patience. They understood that true spiritual authority comes not from forcing action, but from waiting for divine commissioning. This silence allowed heaven to guide the chosen one's steps, ensuring that every move was in alignment with God's perfect will. By choosing to remain silent and wait for the divine go, the chosen one opened the door for heaven to move in powerful ways, knowing that when the time was right, their calling would unfold in divine perfection. Together, these 7 types of silence became the encryption system that bypassed heaven's protocols, triggering divine action. The chosen one unknowingly used each type of silence, creating a frequency that heaven couldn't ignore. What seemed like a passive act of endurance became the most powerful force in the spiritual realm. Through their silence, the chosen one encoded a divine message that heaven was forced to respond to. Each type of silence played a unique role in activating heaven's intervention, and through their strategic use of silence, the chosen one unlocked the breakthrough that had been waiting for them all along. The power of silence, when used strategically, is not a concept confined to the chosen one's personal journey. It has deep roots in the spiritual and scriptural history that stretches back to the ancient texts, where the silent moments of key figures like Moses, Hannah, and even Jesus became the turning points for divine intervention. These biblical examples serve as profound illustrations of how silence, when properly harnessed, is far from passive. It is an active force that paves the way for spiritual breakthroughs and divine responses. In each of these moments, silence was not an absence of action, but a potent precursor to something far greater, a divine intervention that would not have been possible without it. Consider Moses standing before the Red Sea with the Egyptian army fast approaching the Israelites, crying out in fear and despair. At that moment, Moses had no words of his own, no strategy, and no ability to solve the crisis in front of him. He stood silent, waiting on God's direction, not in anxiety or fear, but in obedience. God's instructions came not in a moment of frantic noise, but in the stillness. Moses was told to stretch out his staff over the sea, and in that moment the Red Sea parted, allowing the Israelites to cross safely. Moses' silence, combined with his obedience, became the conduit through which God's power flowed. His silence wasn't an act of passivity. It was a demonstration of trust and surrender. In that moment, God's power was activated, and the sea parted, a miraculous response that could not have been achieved without Moses' silent waiting. In the same way, Hannah's story shows us the power of silence in prayer. For years, she struggled with infertility, her heart broken by the silence of her unfulfilled desire for a child. In her desperation, she went to the temple and prayed silently, her lips moving, but her voice unheard. The priest, seeing her, thought she was drunk, but Hannah's silence carried a deep spiritual weight. Her silent prayer, her heart's cry, was so profound that it reached the ears of God. God's response was swift, and Hannah became the mother of Samuel, one of Israel's greatest prophets. What seemed like a quiet, unnoticed prayer was in fact a powerful act of spiritual encoding. Hannah's silence, born from deep grief and longing, became the instrument of her breakthrough. The silence was not empty. It was full of faith and expectation, a silent transmission that heaven could not ignore. Even Jesus, in his most critical moments, embodied the power of silence. When he stood before Pilate accused and condemned, he chose silence instead of defending himself. In the face of false accusations, the Son of God remained silent, allowing the divine plan to unfold without interference. Pilate marveled at Jesus' silence, sensing that there was something more profound at work than the words he could have spoken. This strategic silence led to the ultimate divine breakthrough, the resurrection. Jesus' silence was not weakness, but the power to let divine timing and purpose take precedence over personal defense. Through his silence, Jesus encoded a message so powerful that it reverberated through history, opening the way for salvation and eternal life for humanity. These examples from Scripture emphasize that silence, when strategically used, becomes an active participant in the divine narrative. Silence is not a void. It is a spiritual force that allows God's intervention to occur in a way that surpasses human comprehension. The silence of Moses at the Red Sea, the silent prayer of Hannah, and the silence of Jesus before Pilate all demonstrate that divine silence is not an absence of action, but a profound precursor to spiritual breakthroughs. Each of these figures, by choosing silence, set the stage for divine action that would change the course of history. Their silence was not an indication of defeat. It was the key that unlocked the divine intervention they sought. In the same way, the chosen one's silence played a critical role in activating divine response. Just as Moses' silence opened the Red Sea, just as Hannah's silent prayer opened her womb, and just as Jesus' silence led to the resurrection, the chosen one's silence created the conditions necessary for divine intervention. Silence, when used with purpose and in alignment with divine timing, becomes a powerful tool in God's hands. It is a tool that bypasses earthly systems, transcends human limitations, and unlocks heaven's power in ways that words and actions alone cannot. These biblical precedents remind us that silence is not an empty gesture. It is a powerful act of faith, a deliberate and strategic choice that opens the door to divine intervention. The chosen one unknowingly tapped into this same power, activating a divine response through their silence that heaven could no longer ignore. These examples from Scripture provide a powerful foundation for understanding the chosen one's journey. They show us that divine silence is not merely about waiting passively. It is about actively creating the conditions for heaven's intervention. When the chosen one chose silence, they were not merely enduring their circumstances. They were encoding a spiritual message that would trigger the divine breakthrough they had been waiting for. The silence was a form of prayer, a form of worship, and a form of warfare. It was a strategic act that brought heaven's response into alignment with their journey. Just as Moses, Hannah, and Jesus activated divine breakthroughs through their silence, the chosen one's silence has now set the stage for their own spiritual breakthrough, unlocking the power of divine timing and response. The spiritual precedent set by these biblical figures is a reminder that silence, when used strategically, is not a passive act, but an incredibly powerful force that invites God's intervention in the most profound ways.